This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Smaranda Dochia, and this episode is part of our series, AI, Ethics and Trust in Coaching, exploring what responsible practice requires as artificial intelligence enters coaching, learning, and human development. Our opening conversation with Dr. David Drake invited us to ask what coaching is ultimately here to do. Today, we move from purpose to responsibility. As clients increasingly turn to AI for reflection, advice, emotional support, career questions, and coaching-like conversations, the developmental space is no longer held only between a coach and a client. It may also invite an AI platform, a technology provider, an employer, a supervisor, and other stakeholders whose responsibilities are not always visible or clearly understood. My guest is Dr. Benita Mayhead, executive coach, coaching supervisor, educator, researcher, and author. Her pioneering research examines how coaches understand and enact duty of care, not as a box to tick or a code to follow, but as something continuous, relational, developmental, and systemic. In this conversation, we explore what it means to care well when technology enters a space built on trust and vulnerability. We examine ethical maturity, competence, contracting, professional boundaries, mental health risks, escalation, supervision, and the difficult question of who is accountable when responsibility is shared across a wider system. At the heart of the episode is a simple question. When AI enters the coaching space, what does it mean to take proper care of the human being within it? Welcome, Benita. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Smaranda. It's a real honor. I'm really excited about this conversation. I've been looking forward to it. Thank you.
So, Benita, before we get into ethics and AI, tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that brought you to this research.
Thank you. I'm an executive coach and I'm a coach supervisor. I'm also on the board for EMCC UK, as well as a director for coaching practice. So I have a real interest in the field and how we can help shape and help develop coach capability when it comes to ethical practice. My background previously, I've been self-employed for 27 years. And previously to that, I worked in the corporate world. So I was with Citigroup, Merrill Lynch and the oil and gas industry before that. But the specific topic of ethics and duty of care being that grain in the sand that really was within all of that came about through my doctoral research, which was completed a couple of years ago. And my research study was on exactly that topic. How do executive coaches make sense of and enact duty of care in practice?
Well, sounds like you're in the perfect place for our podcast as we are focusing on AI, ethics, trust, and coaching. So I just wanted to create that foundation for our audience, for everything that we'll be discussing from this moment onwards in all the episodes. Let's start there. So what exactly your research was all about?
When I was starting to think about what is really going to be the research question that I'm going to be focusing on for the doctorate, I found it quite interesting that when we look at what is out there in literature, there was very little empirical research on ethics in coaching. There were a couple of studies that had been conducted, but only really looking at when practitioners are facing an ethical dilemma, when they're in that point where you get those red flags and you know that something is wrong. So what do you do with them? There wasn't anything there. So my thinking was, how can I make a contribution to theory and to practice on this topic of what does duty of care mean in practice? Less about the legalities, and I think that's an important differentiator. So what we'll probably get into as we talk through is much more of the lived experience. So how does it show up in practice? With practitioners are often grappling at the edges sometimes in terms of you get those senses and you get those feelings, and this is where supervision absolutely comes in. But I really wanted to focus on when we strip it all back, where do practitioners get their sense making from in duty of care? Where does it come from in their own minds, their own understanding of it? And how does it then manifest and show up? A couple of things that came out from the research was around the sense making of duty of care. Unless practitioners had come from a regulated profession previously, so let's say law or clinical or even accountancy, something that's regulated, unless they had come from those professions where those individuals had a really firm grasp and understanding of duty of care, other practitioners who hadn't come from that, their sense making and understanding very much came from their lived experience, from their values, from their beliefs, from their own lives. And that really informed what it would have meant to them. Interestingly, it didn't come from coach training across the board. So that's not where the real understanding comes from. That's not to say that it's not happening in coach training. I'm not here discrediting coach training at all. Yet when asked the question, people's minds go to, well, actually, what does it mean to me in my lived experiences, my values and my beliefs?
I like that though, because there's a difference to it. It'll be much more embedded in your own thinking if it doesn't come just from training, but it comes from your own ethical stance, your own values, and how you regard the world. And you tend to forget the training when you're in a certain situation, but your instincts are going to come in first.
Absolutely. And what the research showed was when you're in those situations, practitioners, they don't reach for a code of ethics, or they don't reach for a textbook. They don't reach for a training manual in figuring out all the law and figuring out what do I do with this. So those elements, I sort of describe it when I talk about in my book, Duty of Care in Coaching. What I talk about is those elements, training, codes of ethics, the law, and textbooks that we may have, they almost provide us with the scaffolding. So that gives us our scaffolding. So we can use those as our guides, but it's not going to do the job for us. When we hit that wall and we find ourselves in that point of an ethical dilemma, the research showed we reach for another human being. We reach for another human being, and that can be a peer. That can be the dialogue we have with a peer. And also really fundamentally important is that's where supervision comes in. And it showed the more maturity, not in age, but in terms of experience that practitioners have, the more supervision they have and they go to, because the complexity of caseload is increasing often. So therefore, there's more nuance, there's more depth, it's more complex.
And there's more awareness, and that maturity is also flagging things for you and saying, oh, this may not be right. So I should probably have a conversation with my supervisor around that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is the awareness part of it. And that would really make a fascinating study to see how much of it is that, so that we are more aware. And the more experience we have, we see more things. And then how do we keep ourselves really sharp with that so that we are attuned to it still? So this is where our own sense making and that ethical maturity, it is an ongoing development piece. It's not a destination. It's not something where we arrive at and say, I'm now ethically mature. So I think there's a confidence piece here for practitioners in recognizing that it's okay to feel stuck and to feel unstable sometimes, because that's part of the process.
Absolutely. Going back to your research, what did you discover through the research that most challenged or surprised you?
The sense-making part of it, that our sense-making, what does it mean? It comes from our values, beliefs, our lived experience. That was the one thing. Also, how it's enacted. How does it show up in practice? Because when we talk about duty of care, it goes beyond some of the fundamentals that we would have in place. So, for example, our formal contract of engagement, it goes beyond that. What the research showed is it's demonstrated by the practitioner through all interactions they have with the client, through contracting and recontracting, through their standards of how they're operating. So this is not around whether I'm a good practitioner or not, but it's around if somebody is operating as a, let's say, accredited master practitioner, there is a standard that needs to be coming with that. So the client will have an expectation, and rightly so. How are they operating at that standard? It comes from boundaries as well. So it's the boundaries that we understand and we set for ourselves. And this really comes into the AI conversation as we move into that, because this is a really big thing within there. Also, interestingly, was the ripple effect. Now, duty of care, we have practitioners, they talk about, I have a duty of care to the client, to the person who's in front of me. I also have a duty of care to the customer who's paying the bill, for example. They may also have a duty of care to an associate organisation. Perhaps they're going in as an associate. But interestingly, from that phenomenological perspective, practitioners also recognise how they had a wider responsibility to the people they would never meet. So the client comes into the room with many other people with them, metaphorically, of course, and the coach is never going to meet them, be it family, be it team members, be it wider areas of their lives.
It's the system, as we call it, systemic coaching.
Yeah, the systemic elements of it. It also, interestingly, there was a whole piece that came up around endings and how, as practitioners, what's our duty of care to our clients when it comes to endings? and we don't have research on this, but I think it would be another really great study. How does our own association with endings manifest in our coaching relationship? So if we find endings hard, difficult to say goodbye, difficult to let go, does the practitioner hold on to the client for longer than they need? The door is always open. I'm always here. So some of those things came through as well, which was interesting. And the final part in how it's demonstrated is through the reflective practice and through supervision. So we are less litigious in the UK. I'm speaking from the UK. We are less litigious in the UK to other jurisdictions. However, cases are brought against practitioners. And there is a serious element in how do practitioners leave a breadcrumb trail of what it is they're doing in their practice. How are they demonstrating their duty of care? What is it they are doing through contracting boundaries, standards, systemic lens, endings, through reflective practice and supervision, so that they have almost their own log of how they are enacting ethical practice. So that was something that really came out from the research, which was not something we're really talking about too much in the field, perhaps.
No, and it sounds like a lot for the practitioners to think of and be mindful of with every contract, with every coaching engagement.
Completely. It is a lot. I describe it as it's the backpack that we're carrying, and within it, we have these 7 volumes of these elements that I've just described there. But this isn't linear either. It's not linear. It's not we go through the process like this and then we're at the endings and then we'll go and have supervision. That would be very straightforward, and it's far more than that. So therefore, how do we hold all that as the practitioner? And this comes from this piece about this really understanding what we're there for. So I do my own coaching approach in what's my philosophy? Why am I here as a coach, and what's my role with the client within here? So there's almost a step right back in what does it mean to be a coach, so how we really identify with that, and then how that then informs our practice in a very thoughtful and a meaningful way.
Fantastic. Going back to the foundation of our series, why ethics is so important in coaching?
Why is it so important? It's really the foundation. This is the foundation. If we are building on shaky foundations, then we are setting ourselves up for something perhaps that is not in best service of our clients and the wider system, as we've already said from there. So it really does form the foundation and almost that golden thread that runs through. And with the coaching bodies, with where we talk about ethical practice, it's absolutely there. Yet I do find when we come to the topic of ethics, you can almost feel sort of like, well, you can see the eyes glazing over a little bit and like, oh, is this something that I need to tick a box against here? Is this something that I need to do? And it's done. So what we want to do is to really change the perception of it. So for this to become, we can bring energy into this. We can bring additional thinking into this. We can get practitioners to be more excited and to be leaning into this more. Because when we do that, it's super interesting. It's super interesting. But it really does come back to that fundamental question of how do practitioners really understand themselves? I think this is the first part of it in how we do the work on ourselves in understanding our own decision making, some of that real critical thinking in what is it that I'm doing and why, and how does that stack up ethically? Because it has different meanings to different people, going back to our own values and our own beliefs. So there is always going to be some difference. But if we're really clear and really sure, then that's when it can be more congruence.
Just for our audience, you mentioned duty of care quite a bit. And I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands what we actually mean by duty of care.
From the legal perspective, so this sits within tort law. So common law being around how if a claim of negligence were to be brought against a practitioner, the court would want to establish, first of all, that a duty of care had been present and then that it had been breached. So there are 4 elements that they would be looking for. So it sits within the legal framework within there. Now, when we look at coaching literature again, and this comes from a great book on sport coaching, actually, but there is confidence that when we look at this more globally across common law jurisdictions, we can see that this stands up in the fundamental principle of us ensuring that we do not cause foreseeable harm. So this being the piece that most people really identify with. How do I ensure that I'm not causing foreseeable harm in my practice? So that's it from that side of it. And then back to what we were saying in terms of our understanding of it in that real lived experience, this is when we have more of the phenomenological part of it. And so this is how it really shows up in our own lives, and that being informed much more so through our own lived experience, values and beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously for the coaching profession, or those who are part of the profession, let alone many people call themselves coaches, but they're not necessarily part of our coaching profession. So leaving that aside, those who are members of associations of all the coaching bodies, they do adhere to our global code of ethics that all the coaching bodies have created together, and they do then sign together. So that's kind of the entry point into this conversation. And we refer to it a lot, but that what happens then or what happens next is really important. And you were describing earlier duty of care as something developmental rather than something that we achieve through initial training or through accreditation. What does that ethical maturity look like in practice?
We see it through how practitioners are more comfort with ambiguity, more comfort with questions, more comfort with the grey areas, with us not needing to be striving to be finding the solution or the answer, or the client not being able to. So being able to really sit with that. That's one of the areas that we see as that growing from there. And I think when you talk about there with the codes of ethics, and absolutely with the global code of ethics, for example, with AC, EMCC, and then another 10, I think there's 12 signatories, aren't there, on it? What has come through from there in the latest version of it is the front section of it talks about values and talks about what they mean in practice. So I think that we are moving in a direction to be able to help practitioners to identify with that. So with that ethical maturity part of it, with how our own values play out, and really understanding and appreciating when there may be a collision. So when we're in that situation and we sense the values are colliding, now sometimes that can be in a positive way, sometimes that can be in a negative way, sometimes are we colluding with the client. So there is an exploration part for practitioners to be doing, and how we can be sensing when that may be happening and being comfortable with it. So developing that confidence in recognizing that. When I work with practitioners who are coming into the field in my coach supervision practice, you can sometimes feel it with them thinking about what's the next question to be asking. Where do I need to go next with the client? And as the maturity develops, there's more greater comfort in sitting with the space and sitting and allowing the client to be really leading. And we don't know where it's going to go, but what's most helpful to the client in that moment within there. I think another part with ethical maturity is we see from a practical level, and this came through from the research, practitioners who had greater experience, and I'm not putting a judgment on that, it's not about good or bad, but greater experience and more longevity in the field, it's easier to say no to assignments. It's easier to step away and to say that's not for me and to refer on to someone else. Whereas when we have practitioners who are perhaps coming into the field and are wanting to build their practice, and some real practical pieces on here, and people need to pay their bills, and again, no judgment on there. It can be harder for people to say no, and also recognizing when is the right time to say no.
Yeah, it's about the boundaries you were mentioning earlier on. And it's hard.
Yeah.
Because it's that piece of awareness as well. As you are more mature as a coach, you're realizing what's that gray line as well. There's a line that you don't want to cross, and it's not always obvious in coaching where the line is, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I really agree with that. It's not obvious where the line is, and our line might be different to where the client's line is. So another part with the ethical maturity part of it is, again, something I talk about in the book and talk about in my research. It's up to the practitioner to set those guardrails with the client. It's not for the client. We are going in as the expert, not in terms of the knowledge, but we're going in as the professional in inverted commas within there. So it's up to us to set that ethical domain for the client to be able to step into. Once they're in it and we've been through the contracting and we've got the agreement, okay, then we're off, and then it absolutely led by the client. But there is something about how, as a practitioner, that's our responsibility, that's our ethical responsibility to be stepping into that and to be showing the client and explaining. And I think we can make many assumptions on what a client understands and maybe thinks coaching is and their expectations. So sometimes with some of those assignments, we may have quite a tricky assignment that's positioned to us. So we may need to take a couple of steps back, and there's almost some pre-contracting before we even get to contracting. So there's an element of how, as practitioners, that confidence is developed to be saying, hang on a minute, to the client, let's really have a look at this and have a think about this as to whether this is the right thing.
So there is a lot of complexity when it comes to ethics and duty of care as it is in coaching, and surely something that is not new in terms of our conversations. Always good to get into these conversations. What happens when AI comes in?
Oh, and here we go.
Here we go.
Yeah, what does happen when AI comes in? I don't think we really know yet properly. I don't think we really know. My perspective from what I see, we are running at such a fast pace. We are outrunning our theoretical foundations on this. Research cannot keep up. And I know you're going to have some really great episodes coming through on the research part as you go through this series, which I'm super excited to listen to. So we don't know, I think, is the honest answer on that. And we are entering into even more complexity. As you said there, it's complex enough as it is. So back to what we were saying earlier on in the conversation, we can have our coaching bodies, our professional bodies are responding, and we have codes of ethics for working with AI. We obviously have legislation that is there and for us to be adhering to. However, we're working in real time with clients, and our clients are using AI, and it's up to us as practitioners to skill ourselves up in this. We can't sit and wait for somebody to tell us what's okay to do and what's not okay to do. We have to go and figure this out for ourselves as practitioners, because we don't know what may be coming through in terms of some of the ethical challenges and ethical implications yet. And I think it will hit. We're way behind yet. Even without AI in the mix of it, we don't really have a handle on what type of claims are brought against practitioners. I mean, we know from the internal perspective, ICF opened their books to me, for example, when I conducted the research in the beginning, and all of the complaints that have been brought against coaches was shared, which was heavily redacted and very safely done. A big piece of work for them, but really important to see the types of complaints that are coming in. And obviously, AC, you'll have complaints, EMCC, we have complaints. Outside of that, we've no way of knowing what is going on. Now we're throwing AI in. My fear, and I'm not a naysayer at all. I'm not a naysayer. I don't use AI in my coaching practice, and that's personal choice and some reasons for that. Yet I do work with practitioners who do, and have seen some really great work and real respect for people that are really striving for ethical practice with using AI. It's up to the practitioners to be really thinking deeply and using real critical thinking in the decision making before employing AI.
And of course, there is a lot to say around compliance and the legal aspect of it and governance. You mentioned there's the EU AI Act for Europe. In UK, you have also legislation around AI. So we'll not be getting into that now. Actually, our next episode is about that, and we'll have an interesting conversation around that entire legal framework. However, for our conversation now, I'm thinking when an AI system participates in reflection or feedback or even emotional support, how does the coaching space change?
How does it change? I think there's a couple of things on this. I think there is something about when we're hearing from practitioners who are saying, my client is using AI to help decipher the conversation that I've just had with them, and the client is coming into the coaching conversation and saying, I've spoken to whatever AI they're using, and this is what's come back. So I think that there's a change we're seeing with that. So how practitioners are getting comfortable in there is someone else in the room that is being used by the client to be coming in. And arguably, perhaps it is different, but clients will talk to their family members, they'll talk to friends, they'll talk to colleagues about something that may have come out of a coaching session. So I think there is how do practitioners lean into that? So to work with the client in them understanding, okay, well, how helpful is that? And to be challenging some of the thinking back on that. I think that where it changes as well, and I think it depends what we mean when we're talking about AI, for example. So we use the term broadly and a lot. And I think there is something about how practitioners understand what does it mean and how they are utilizing different mechanisms within the practice and for what purpose. So where it changes, I think there can be some real positives, as we are seeing from anecdotal information we have. But there are also some grey areas where when we think about permission, we think about how a practitioner may be using AI, but how explicit are they being with seeking permission from their client in terms of where that information is going, how it's stored, how it's used. There is also a further element as well, I think, is when we see AI coming into the supervision space, which is a further dimension onto this that we're not really talking about, because let's say we have the practitioner seeks permission and agreement with the client that they are going to be using AI, and this is a mutual agreement. If that same intervention gets taken into supervision, we're crossing some different boundaries there because the coach is bringing client information into the supervision space. Now, has the coach sought client permission explicitly and beyond there in terms of there may be one step further on of who is it that the client has been talking about? So you start to have, again, we've got another systemic piece on here that we're not really looking at really clearly. Now, the responsibility on this really lies with the supervisor. So we have a further element here in how do we ensure that supervisors are aware and understanding what the implications are with bringing AI into the supervision space. There are some other pieces about how practitioners are using it for self-reflection. And again, some pros and cons within there. We will get back what we feed in. So are we going to be looking at, oh yeah, I'm doing a really great job. So some of the critical pushback and how we can ensure that we are maybe bolstering with the human element within there as well. So I see the change and the difference. If we've got people who are quite evangelical about it and, oh, this is going to change everything and it's going to solve everything, I'm not so sure. Where we have people that are using it critically and mindfully and with real ethical practice at the forefront. And, this is something for us to be exploring more.
Yes, absolutely. And there is also a question of, as you're saying, which AI we are using. You can use the general LLM language model, your preferred platform, whether Claude, ChatGPT, whichever that is, Gemini, for all of these things, which I think many practitioners do to support them in their practice. And you're used to it because you start using it for your marketing and it works well. And then it's like not so far. Then you're working out your contracts. You find that helpful. And then, one thing leads to another and you start using it in your practice with your client data, with your client work and so on and so forth. And say you do have all the permissions in place and your contracts are up to date and everything is fine. Still, there is that ethical aspect that comes into play, as in which system are you using for this and what does that mean? And then, of course, there are the more specialized AIs that are built specifically for supervision, for coaching. So there is a difference there. How do you find that difference?
Yeah, there is the difference there, and how we can see with individuals who may be augmenting their practice with bringing in some things to really help and to support it, and where we see the development of bots, of coach bots, for example, as well. So we can see much more in the growth of that. The piece that I come back to always is for practitioners to do their own thinking, their own digging in terms of really looking at the supplier that's behind that. So really starting to ask some of those ethical questions themselves in terms of how has this been built and designed? Not for them to be the development experts and the engineering architects at all, but really think more critically on this. In whose service is this? And I think that's a key question to come back to all of the time. If we are bringing AI in whose service is it? Is it in service of the client in enabling and developing them, or is it in service of me as a practitioner? Am I feeling that I'm being left behind and I need to get onto this? Am I feeling that I'm not going to get any work, so therefore I need to be able to be expanding? So I think there are some bigger questions for people to be thinking about in the beginning, in their decision making, in why it is that they're bringing it in and who's behind it.
And then we have the other situation, and you mentioned this a little bit, when the client turns to AI independently. And it's interesting now a lot of the doctors are being faced with this, that your patients are coming and they're like, well, I talked to ChatGPT and it told me that this is such a problem. And now give me the prescription, which is a new space we are in. So imagine that the client is using a general AI platform between coaching sessions to explore their anxiety or grief or a difficult relationship or career crisis, whatever they are going through. The coach did not recommend the system and may not even know that it's being used. Who carries the duty of care in that context?
There's a great perspective in thinking about who carries the duty of care. In that scenario there, the coach hasn't recommended it. This is client agency. This is their choice to be doing that. And absolutely, it sits with them. That's their responsibility from a client perspective. It's not the coach's responsibility. I think also it's how we embrace that some people will want different types of support. So some people will not want to be talking to a human being necessarily about some particular parts. It's easier for them to talk to an AI, and be it to some fundamentals in I'm not having to be in that person-to-person relationship. I'm not having to build that rapport and that trust on that human level, and I'm not going to be judged. I'm going to get some straightforward responses back. So I can see for some people absolutely how that can be a supplementary support for them. I suppose that where it transfers over into the coaching space is, what does the coach do with that? So what does the coach do when that's brought in by the client? And this comes back to our boundaries. So I think that there is something about how the practitioner really, through contracting, is really clear and explicit with the client in what's the coach's role if the client is bringing in AI generated pieces in. That part of it, it doesn't concern me so much. This is the way people are moving and people are going. And exactly as you said, people are using it in all parts of their lives to book a holiday, to do a tour guide or plan a dinner or whatever it may be. So, it's part and parcel, and also for organizations, how they're using it in part of their professional practice. So I think that for practitioners, if we are taking a position of no, I'm not going to enter into any AI understanding and awareness, I think that we're perhaps missing something within there, because our clients are. So I think there's a responsibility we have to be gearing ourselves up a little bit, even if we're not using it in our own practice, but our own awareness and understanding.
That makes me think, should now AI be introduced or included in your contract or recontract?
It's a really good point. One of the things that I've been talking to practitioners about is for practitioners who are using AI as part of their coaching practice, and they are explicit about that, and there's agreement that has been reached with the client and with the customer. So again, this is beyond, we need to think about the systemic element in there. How does their insurance stack up? So this is something perhaps that people are not thinking about necessarily. Are they insured? So this is something to go back to individual insurance providers that they have, and how am I covered legally in terms of should a claim be brought against me, and really being explicit in terms of where does the responsibility lie legally for that. So that's a bit of a red flag for people who are using it, to be saying, make sure the documentation part of it is really in order so that you're protected and also your client's protected as well.
The other aspect of it, and we're going to have an episode on that, AIs are becoming more and more human in terms of conversation. So what happens when a client discloses vulnerability to a system that can respond conversationally, but cannot truly assume responsibility for them?
This comes back to agency, and it comes back to contracting, and it comes back to clear boundaries. And this is the evolution of where we are with what practitioners may be choosing to bring into their contracting and their boundary setting, because it may be that practitioners don't know that a client is intending to be using an AI to support them as they're going through their coaching practice. So I think that there is something about how we can signpost, and we can be very explicit in the beginning in saying, if you are using an AI to support and to help you alongside the work that we're doing, you may choose to be bringing some of that into the coaching sessions, but this is your responsibility. So I think that there needs to be something that is very clearly demarcated within here. It's similar to, if a client is bringing through a reflective question that they've come up with themselves that they're wanting to bring into the coaching space to talk about, that's very normal. That's very normal. But I think where we've got to be careful is if the working part that the client has with the AI, and if it's getting into recommendations in terms of, this is what I think that you should do, then I think that's where we have to be careful, because that's not what the coach is doing. That's not what the coach is saying. So I think we just need to be really clear.
And there are coaches who are building their own support for in between coaching sessions and so on. And that's where they are responsible for it. It's a different kind of conversation.
Yeah.
Going back to your research, it challenges the idea that the coach's responsibility ends with the individual client. So we're discussing about the system. How should we think systemically about AI and duty of care?
Yeah, great question. There is the real knock-on effect here. It's who else is in the system. Back to some of the permissions part of it as well. So I use the example of with supervision, if AI is being brought in, then the systemic lens of, well, who else is metaphorically being brought into the room by the practitioner when they're working with the supervisor. So we have the whole permission part of it on there. With how we move forward with this, I think that this is where we are at a new frontier with how we are looking at organizations who are using more AI type interventions with wider populations. And we're seeing rollouts of automated coaching. I think there's a conversation as to, is it coaching or is it more problem solving? If we think coaching is relational and this is on the human to human, then there is something in terms of the language that we're using within there. And again, for practitioners that are working really at the front of this, when we're in conversations with organizations, I think there's a responsibility for us in how we can help our organizations ask some different questions and be thinking about the ethical implications that we may be having within there. So yeah, I would say absolutely back to some of those boundaries that we're setting in place for ourselves and how we're helping in that education part of it.
What do you see from your experience that is currently happening in organizations when it comes to exactly those kind of platforms that are coaching platforms being introduced? What happens there and how does it feel as an employee to be in that space?
I think there's two parts to this. I think we have digitally enabled coaching platforms where organizations, so coaching organizations, they have their big coaching platforms and working within client groups and people are matched and they have their conversations, and this can be done at greater scale, it's greater reach, and they're still working with a human. So I think that we've seen a rise in those coaching platforms over recent years. And then we have the AI space where we have organizations who are bringing in AI to support the development of their people, and we're seeing greater reach. So this is opening up opportunity for workforces who would not have had that opportunity to be exploring particular elements of their role. Now, what the AI is actually doing, though, comes back to my point earlier. Is this coaching or is this more day-to-day problem solving? This is task analysis. And really helpful if it's helping an executive before they're going into a meeting and I haven't got this together yet. And can you give me some tips and hints? I think that there's some real benefit in how we can fast track some of that execution of tasks within organizations and for that efficiency. Absolutely. Whether it's coaching and how we understand coaching, that's where I'm still on the fence, really. I'm yet to see that this is really coaching. And I think that we've got further to go on that. I think that when we look at some of the research that has been published already on task management, orientation, on objectives, yes. When we're talking about some of the deeper relational elements, and if we're talking about a lot of the stuff that comes, I work as an exec coach, as I said, a lot of the things that come into the coaching sessions, it's on a relational element. This is around human interaction. This will be around stakeholder management, engagement. It's much deeper. It's on an emotional level. So therefore, I think that there's a difference. And if organizations are wanting to be using AI to go for that side of it, the human part of it, I think that's still where we need human beings. I don't see that changing. I think that will continue. I think there will be that element of that slice where that's where we need the human interaction.
We touched upon supervision in various aspects, but I'm wondering, what do you think is the role that supervision plays when AI becomes part of the coaching practice?
My philosophy on supervision is we are working, the supervisory relationship with the coach is different to the coach-client relationship. The supervisory relationship, this is my philosophy and my supervision model, we're shoulder to shoulder. So we are working as colleagues. We are having a look at a particular scenario, dilemma, whatever it may be, and we are taking that systemic look together. And this is the supervisor's role within there. When we're with coach client, it's a different relationship. There is a differentiator that's within there, within the two. So what's the role of the supervisor? Similarly to as we've talked about already, so if we are saying for practitioners, as I said, it's up to practitioners to be skilling themselves up and to be doing the understanding. The scaffolding is there for how to operate legally and how to operate within the codes of ethics so that they are ensuring they are within the boundaries. But that's not enough. There needs to be further knowledge and that critical thinking in the decision making and what they're bringing in. I think the same applies to the supervisor. So I think in-house supervisors are skilling themselves up to be understanding and having, even if they're not using it, and this is not about us all adopting it and using it, but I think we need to have an awareness and I think we need to have a perspective on it to be able to help shape that conversation and to be able to look critically through that reflective lens that supervision lends itself to, where the practitioner is looking at what is it that I'm bringing into the coaching space. So to be able to really challenge that in a supportive way.
I have the feeling that this will become the thread of our entire podcast series. The awareness and the educational piece, it comes up in every conversation. Exactly what you were just saying, the fact that we don't need to move into using AI, we don't need to embrace it all, but just having that awareness of everything that is happening around us. And maybe exactly that piece in which AI becomes part of that system and always being mindful of the wider system. Something for coaches, I guess they need to be mindful of.
You raise a really important point there. It is part of the system. It is there. And we may not always know. Perhaps there's something that comes into this in how the assumption is that it is there. Maybe there is a different approach that we're taking in assuming that it is, and then us operating from that standpoint and thinking that through. With the supervision element as well, by no means is this about supervisors having the answers and being able to lead the way on that. I think this is one of the really great pieces where we don't know. We don't know. So how can practitioners work with their supervisors to help figure it out? I think that there's a dual piece within here. And it happens in supervision practice. There'll be a practitioner that brings something and it will be, well, neither of us know. Let's go into this and let's see where we land. So the open-mindedness and that curiosity in being able to do some digging and do some wider thinking, bring that systemic lens onto it to widen that peripheral vision, I think is a really good opportunity within there for supervisors to help the practitioner and also themselves.
Touching upon the dedicated AI coaching bots or reflective practice systems for coaches to use that are AI based. So those type of things where it's responsibly built. Where do you stand on that? Let's start there.
For myself personally, in my own practice, and really happy to share, the work I do and the organisations that we work with and the type of cases that we have is very much a human to human, and it will remain like that. And that's my own personal choice in where I am. And I recognise that there are practitioners who are going to be them using themselves or organisations that are using it. I'm fearful in some areas that we are running too fast and we don't know what the longer term implications are, where we have some organisations who, it's been really great to be working with them, who are building ethically responsible platforms. So that's where I'm really hoping that those are the people that can continue to lead the charge. And for the discerning practitioners in really thinking about their choices in picking the platforms that are ethically robust rather than perhaps what may be the next new shiny thing. I have a fear also where we have practitioners who are perhaps yet to really embed their own craft. So they are very new in perhaps, and then they are using AI and they're employing AI. And my fear is, do we need to get the solid foundations of being a practitioner first on the human to human before we're bringing in AI? Because we don't necessarily know what we don't know. So that's a fear that I have where I see people entering the profession now who are yet to develop perhaps the ethical maturity in some regards as a practitioner and are moving straight into the AI space. That's a bit of a fear and a concern that I have.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's very valuable to hear it. When you're saying a build that is ethical and responsibly designed, what do you mean, just for our audience to know?
I'm not technical by any means. So I put that out as a caveat. First of all, I am not technical. So please don't judge me on my non-technical capability. I think it's about looking at what has been going in behind this. So what are some of the red flags and the stops and the triggers? So how are some pieces recognized and identified, perhaps if there is a sense of a mental well-being issue that's coming up here? What is happening here in terms of signposting and red flagging to the practitioner if they're using that? I think there's also elements in terms of how is this built from a values perspective? You know, how much of value is informing this? How do we know whether the client's values are being taken into consideration within here? And again, when we're looking at the ethically responsible platforms that are being developed and are out there, some of these things are being taken into consideration and now going into the modeling behind it so that the guidance and where it goes with the client is very much in the client's needs. And again, that's the fundamental part of it, in whose service. So is the AI in service of the client? So that's the other part of it in terms of the ethical responsibility in the platform design and who's behind it, some of those decision pieces within there. So those are some of the things that I would think about within the thinking, the thought processes that people might go through before choosing and selecting.
Thank you for that. And in that context, what should trigger human intervention and who should that human be?
As to who the human should be, I think it depends on the situation. So if the practitioner is using an AI alongside their practice, if it's ethically responsible and it is flagged, one of the things that we always have, and I know with practitioners that I work with as a coach supervisor, is them having their signposting book almost as to who is it that they can put the client in contact with to be able to seek additional support, additional help. Because again, when it comes back to our competence as a coach in terms of our boundaries, where does coaching end and where does therapy start, for want of a better description on it? We have this grey line here that's ever moving. So how does that play out when we're then bringing AI in? I think this is an element of concern, and for the client, for them understanding and appreciating that this boundary has now been met and now we're moving into new domain and new territory. So does that require a different intervention? It happens in the human to human space when we get that sense, we can feel it, we can hear it, we can sense it, and we signpost. That's where the practitioner explains, this is where we're hitting this boundary. What are some of our options and choices as to where we go with this? So I think that's where the development and the ongoing, what I would love to see with AI is how this part of it is really addressed. And perhaps it is, perhaps there's going to be some conversations you're going to have with some people further down the line where this is happening. So that whole a harder boundary is there so it doesn't just drift. So we can really pick people up and ensure that they're safe, because that has to be, coming back to my point earlier, what does duty of care mean? Its core essence, to ensure that we do not cause foreseeable harm. So the same applies within this. Are we causing foreseeable harm by not signposting, by not scooping someone out of it and then getting them the right support that they need?
So we're talking about ethical maturity, not only for the coach, but also for the platform that is being
I know. Yeah, an ethically mature platform. How wonderful.
There it is. We came up with it. There is so much to think about when it comes to this. And it triggers for me something you said earlier about when a new coach starts going on that journey, if they do. Speaking about maturity as well. Because obviously, if you don't have that entire system in your mind and you're not mindful of all the different aspects of it and you don't have that ethical maturity, then it'll be harder to even create that design in a responsible way, for instance. So I'm just thinking at this stage, what responsibilities sit also with the training providers or with the professional bodies when it comes to AI?
I think there is a big responsibility. I think there really is. And again, I think as we were talking about earlier, where we are really we have outrun our theoretical foundations. We're moving faster than we can keep up and research can't keep up. The field can't keep up. So for training providers, this is the new dawn here now. And we are seeing it in some pockets. We are seeing it in some pockets where this is really being addressed. And there are some great examples of that. Yet, if we go back to my original research, when asked on the human to human part of it, where does your sense making of duty of care come from? Across the board, it did not come from coach training. So we're missing an element within there already. And this is when we are talking about the basic fundamentals of what does it mean to be a coach and how I'm showing up in practice with my client. So therefore, for the coach training providers, my shout is, really have a look at your ethics training parts and really see how can you elevate that? How can you bring this in so it's less of a compliance element, it's less of a tick box, which is often how it is assumed. How do you bring this in? How do you bring more of the exciting case studies in? How do you bring some of the fear within here, but in a safe environment? In actually, this is a really big topic and we need to be addressing it, and then lay AI over it as well. So I think that there's an opportunity for training providers to set themselves apart. I think there are some that can really set themselves apart from others in being at the forefront of this. For the coaching bodies, I think there is a big responsibility for the coaching bodies, and we're seeing it in different areas across the coaching bodies. I think there's room for all of the coaching bodies in the world. I think people, coaching bodies offer different things. This is not about setting one up against the other. And I think that we can all learn from each other as well. So what I would love to see some broader roundtable pieces where we bring together the coaching bodies and we really, let's talk, let's share, let's help grow this together. I think that there's a great opportunity for us to be doing that. And I think the final thing on all of that, my message is this is not about being punitive. This is not about us punishing and judging and shaming or anything like that. I think that we are running so fast And we have a chance collectively to take a breath and take a pause and to really think about, what does duty of care mean in this? What are the systemic implications within this? And then how do we collectively as a community really help drive and help shape that narrative in a supportive way, in an encouraging way for the betterment of our members and also their clients?
Absolutely. Beautifully said, Benita. And for the coaching profession and the future of our coaching profession, if there is to be a future to it, bringing everyone together and sitting and discussing all of this, I think it's really, really important. So by all means, let's do that. And it's the reason why we're doing this series as well, just to start those conversations.
Yeah, I love that. One thing I can add in, if I may.
Sure.
As coaches, we're so privileged. We sit and we work with fellow human beings who are complex. And we get to do that. It's something that I don't ever forget. I think this is a really privileged position that we're in. So that comes with a responsibility. That comes with the big weight in the backpack that I talked about. And there is a shared accountability for us in how we can help with our peers as well, who are maybe not thinking about this and not engaging with it. So I think we've got the coaching body side of it, and absolutely would love to be doing more of that from the collective. But I think there's also another level down, our individual responsibility as practitioners in the field who feel very passionately and strongly about the work that we do, in how do we help our fellow colleagues and our peers.
As AI becomes more present in coaching and human development, what is the one question you believe every coach should keep asking in order to honor their duty of care?
I would bring it to the real fundamentals, which is in whose service? In whose service is this? I would bring it right back to that. That would be my guiding principle, my guiding light, to be asking that question. And if we have doubt in thinking, actually, this is more for me, in how I'm developing and building my practice commercially or from efficiency or whatever it may be, then that's another question. If we are believing that coaching is in service of the client and it is about enabling the client to see that open space, to unlock whatever it is, however we want to describe it, then that's something for us to be really bringing ourselves back to from an ethical lens.
Wonderful. Well, Benita, we covered a lot. And thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise and part of your research with our audience today. Final question, where people can find you? Is there anything that you want to share with our audience about the work that you're doing?
They can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place. That's the easiest place. Benita Mayhead, on LinkedIn. I have two practices. I have my corporate practice with my colleague, and then we work in the leadership development space. So people can find us there at north-52.com. And then I have my private practice, which is where my coach supervision sits and where my writing sits and research sits. So they can have a look on there, which is benitamayhead.com. For people who want to read more and learn about it, there is the book. Which was released in September, published by Routledge, Taylor and Francis Group. It's based on the research. It's very accessible. It's written for practitioners. There's reflective pieces at the end of every chapter. So really accessible questions. It is academic, but it's not a heavy lift is the best way that I would describe it. And get in touch. I love talking about this with people and really happy to explore further things with individuals. Thank you so much for the opportunity today.
Thank you so much, Benita. It was wonderful to talk to you. What I take away from this conversation is that duty of care is not something we secure once through training, accreditation, or a well-written contract. It is a continuing practice of judgment, reflection, and responsibility, especially when the circumstances are changing and there is no simple answer. AI may widen access to reflection and support, but it can also distribute responsibility across coaches, organizations, platforms, and providers. Danger is that when responsibility sits everywhere, nobody fully assumes it. Ethical maturity means remaining willing to ask what care requires now in this particular situation for this particular person. I would love to hear what this conversation raised for you. Please share your takeaways on your preferred podcast platform or join the conversation through our LinkedIn posts. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To learn more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our website at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events for your continuing professional development.